There is a strip of lavender I pass on my morning walk, growing straight out of a crack where an old stone step meets a brick wall. Nobody planted it there on purpose. Nobody waters it. Nobody has fed it a single thing in years. And every June, it erupts into a fat, silver, humming mound of purple that stops me in my tracks. Meanwhile, 3 streets over, I know a gardener, a good one, 40 years at it. She has babied her lavender in the finest bed she owns, and it just sulks, pale, leggy, barely a bloom on it. Same plant, 2 completely different fates. And the difference is not luck, and it is certainly not some magic green thumb. It comes down to a handful of small things that the crack-in-the-wall plant gets for free, and the pampered one never does. Here is what I have come to believe after a lifetime of this. With lavender, almost everything we were taught about being kind to a plant is the very thing that is quietly killing it. The plants that live the longest are so often the ones nobody had the heart to fuss over. So here is my promise to you for the next few minutes. I am going to walk you through 10 of these small things. 10 reasons your lavender either takes off or just sits there sulking, and by the end you will be able to look at your own plant and know exactly which ones it is missing. Not one of them is planted in full sun and water less. You have heard that 100 times, and it has not helped. These are the quiet, mechanical reasons the wall plant thrives. And trick number 4 is the one that is going to feel completely backwards. Every instinct you have earned over the years is going to argue with it, and it is still the single biggest lever you have. Trick 1. Before you change a single thing about your soil, turn the plant around and read the label. Because half the lavender heartbreak in this country begins right there at the garden center, with a plant that was never going to survive your winter in the first place. Here is what most folks are never told. Lavender is not one plant. The 2 you will see most often at the store are worlds apart in toughness. English lavender, Lavandula angustifolia, the hidcote and the munstead you have probably grown, is the hardy one. It shrugs off cold down into zone 5, it comes back year after year, and it takes a firm haircut without sulking. Then there is Spanish lavender, with those showy little rabbit ear petals standing up on top, and French lavender with the soft-toothed leaves. They are beautiful. They are also tender. They are happy in zone 8 or 9, and a real northern winter will very often kill them outright. So the mistake is buying the pretty one with the ears, planting it up north, watching it die by March, and quietly deciding that you simply cannot grow lavender. You can. You just bought a Mediterranean vacationer and asked it to spend the winter in Vermont. Getting it right is simple. Match the plant to your winter first, and to the color second. If your winters truly bite, reach for English lavender, or one of the big lavandin hybrids like Grosso or Phenomenal, the ones the commercial growers lean on precisely because they are tough as boots. If you live somewhere mild, where frost is more of a rumor than a season, then enjoy the Spanish and the French all you like. The plant tag has your hardiness zone printed right on it. Read it like it matters, because out of all 10 of these, this is the one that decides whether your plant lives at all. Trick 2, and this is where our very best intentions do the most damage. When most of us plant something we love, we dig a nice generous hole and we fill it with the good stuff. Rich compost, a bag of potting mix, maybe a handful of fertilizer down in the bottom for a treat. For a tomato, that is pure kindness. For lavender, you have just dug it a bathtub. Here is the mechanism, because the why is the whole thing. Lavender comes from thin, stony, fast-draining Mediterranean hillsides. Its entire survival is built on water leaving fast. Now picture heavy clay garden soil. You dig your hole, and you backfill it with soft, fluffy, water-holding compost. Every time it rains, the water runs quickly through that soft pocket you made, and then it hits the hard clay walls of the hole and just sits there. You have built an underground bucket, and the roots sit in that bucket and rot. The plant did not drown because you neglected it. It drowned because you were generous. So do the opposite of what feels caring. Do not enrich that hole. Open it up. If your soil is heavy, cut it hard with coarse grit, horticultural sand, or fine gravel until it feels sharp and loose in your hand instead of soft and spongy. And in really stubborn clay, do not even fight it in the ground. Build up instead. A raised mound, or a gravelly berm gives the water somewhere to go. The goal was never a rich hole. The goal is a hole that water walks straight out of. Given the choice, lavender will take lean and sharp over rich and soggy every single time. Trick 3 is the smallest move on this whole list, and it may just save the most plants. When you set your lavender into the ground, plant it high, plant it proud. Here is what I mean by that. Most of us tuck a new plant in so the soil line sits dead level with the bed, or even a touch below, in a tidy little saucer. And that saucer collects water right where the stems meet the roots, in a spot we call the crown. Now, lavender can take dry feet all day long. What it cannot survive is a wet collar. A crown that stays damp is exactly where the rot begins, and crown rot quietly kills more established lavender than the cold ever will. So lift it. Set the plant so the top of its root ball sits a good inch, even 2, above the soil around it, and mound the earth up gently to meet it, so water sheds outward instead of pooling in. On a slope, angle it so the runoff moves away from the base, not toward it. It looks almost wrong the first time you do it, like the plant is sitting up too high. But that little hump is doing quiet work all winter long, keeping the one spot that matters most bone dry. The growers who plant lavender by the thousand plant it up high on ridges for this exact reason. Borrow the trick from them. It costs you nothing but a minute and a little faith. Trick 4. This is the one I told you to wait for. And here it is, plain and simple. To make your lavender grow faster and bloom harder, you need to feed it less. In most gardens, you need to stop feeding it almost entirely. I know exactly how that lands, because it argues with everything the years have taught you. A struggling plant is a hungry plant. Hungry plants need feeding. More compost, richer soil, a scoop of fertilizer, that is how you help. And with almost anything else in your garden, you would be right. With lavender, that good instinct is the precise reason your plant is leggy, floppy, and stingy with its flowers. Here is the why. When you pour nitrogen and rich feed into lavender, oh, it grows. But it grows the wrong way entirely. It throws out soft, sappy, oversized green. Fast, weak stems that flop open in the middle and hand you leaves where you wanted flowers. That lush green you were hoping for is actually the plant getting fat and lazy. It has no reason to build a strong woody frame or drive its roots down deep, because everything it could ever need is being handed to it right there at the surface. The horticulturists at Utah State University Extension put it about as plainly as it can be put. Overfeeding lavender reduces the flowers, and it makes the plant more prone to disease. You feed it more, and you get less of the one thing you planted it for. Now flip it around. Grow lavender lean, in poor, gritty, hungry ground, and the plant has to go to work. It drives its roots down deep, hunting for water and minerals, and that deep root system is the engine underneath all the fast, healthy top growth you actually wanted. The stems come in woody and strong. The plant pours everything it has into dense silver foliage and armloads of flowers, because in lean conditions, blooming is its whole survival plan. A lean lavender is not a starving lavender. It is a lavender finally doing what it was built to do, at full strength. So the move here, honestly, is to do less. Skip the compost. Hold back the fertilizer, and understand that the hardest part is not the technique at all. It is trusting it, and sitting on your hands while a plant thrives on a little hardship. Trick 5. Let us talk about the thing sitting right on top of your soil, because it is quietly working either for you or against you. Most of us mulch everything in the garden the same way. A nice thick layer of bark chips, or compost, piled up snug around the base. It looks tidy. It feels like good gardening. And around lavender, it is slowly smothering the plant. Here is what is happening down at that base. Soft organic mulch holds moisture like a sponge, and it traps that dampness right up against the crown. It is the wet collar we just talked about, only now you have wrapped it in a warm, wet towel. It keeps the roots cool and soggy, and a cool, soggy lavender plays defense instead of growing. Worse still, it invites in the very rot and fungus that lavender spends its entire life trying to avoid. So swap it out for what I like to call a stone blanket. Spread a layer of light-colored gravel, horticultural grit, or crushed limestone chips around the base, instead of the bark. Two good things happen the moment you do. First, the crown stays bone dry, so rot never gets its foothold. And second, and this is the part almost nobody knows, that pale gravel catches the sunlight and bounces warmth and light straight back up into the underside of the plant. Lavender is a heat lover right down to its roots. Warm its feet from below like that, and you are stretching out its sunny hours and heating the whole root zone. And warm roots are fast roots. It is the very same reason the old commercial fields are so often laid out on pale, stony ground. Those growers are not fighting the rocks. They are using them. Trick 6 is the one you cannot see, which is exactly why it gets missed so often. Airflow. Lavender needs to breathe. Think for a moment about where this plant comes from. Open, windswept hillsides, where a breeze is always moving through the foliage, drying the leaves, carrying the damp away. Now think about how we tend to plant it at home, tucked in tight against the fence, crowded shoulder to shoulder with the roses and the catmint, hemmed in on every side. It looks lovely and full the first year. Then the humid weeks of high summer roll in. The air stops moving through all that crowded growth. The leaves stay damp long after the rain, and the fungal troubles move right in. A lavender that cannot dry off between rains is a lavender living on borrowed time. The fix costs you nothing but a little restraint on planting day. Give each plant real room, anywhere from 1.5 to 3 feet between them, depending on the variety, so the air can move freely through and around every single one. Keep the pushy neighbors trimmed back off its skirts. And if it is already crowded in there, be brave and thin it out. Open it up. You want to be able to see daylight and feel a breeze right through the base of that plant. Lavender does not want to be hugged. It wants a little space and a little wind, the same as it had on the hillside. Trick 7. Now, this is the one where I have to be honest with you in a way that a lot of gardening videos simply will not be. And that is exactly why it is my favorite trick on the whole list. There is a kind of beneficial fungus called mycorrhizae. In healthy soil, it threads itself all through the ground and partners right up with your lavender roots, reaching far out beyond where the roots alone could ever go, pulling in water and minerals and handing them straight back to the plant. And in return, the lavender feeds it a little sugar. It is one of the oldest partnerships in all of nature, and it genuinely gives a plant a root system that behaves as if it were far bigger than it looks. Every word of that is true. That is real, settled science. Here is the part they do not tell you. You will see mycorrhizae sold in little bags at the garden center. A powder you are told to buy and sprinkle into every planting hole for a miracle root system. And Dr. Linda Chalker Scott, the urban horticulturist at Washington State University, who has spent years carefully separating garden folklore from what the evidence actually shows, looked long and hard at those products. Her conclusion is quietly deflating for the folks selling them. In ordinary, healthy garden soil, those fungi are already there. The store-bought powder is often unproven, sometimes not even alive in the bag by the time it reaches your hands, and frequently the wrong species for your plant anyway. For most gardeners, it is money spent on something the ground was already giving them for free. So here is how you actually get it, and it is the whole spirit of this channel in one simple move. You do not buy the partner. You build the conditions, and you let it come to you. Stop tilling your soil down to dust, because that shreds the fungal threads apart. Ease off the heavy fertilizer, because that tells the plant it has no need of a partner at all. And if you truly want to hurry things along, take one single handful of soil from beneath an old, established shrub that has been thriving untouched for years, and drop it into your planting hole. That one handful carries the living network, already awake, already local, already free. And is that not the quiet truth running underneath so much of this? The best thing you can possibly give this plant is the one thing that nobody can bottle, patent, or sell back to you again next spring. There is a reason you never once saw it on a shelf. It costs almost nothing, which, in an industry built on selling you the next bag, is the one thing it is never quite allowed to be. Nobody hid this away in a vault. The market simply never had a reason to keep reminding you of it. Now, before we get into the 2 cuts that can add 10 years to a lavender's life, I have gathered everything so far onto a single page you can tape up inside the shed door. The right plant for your zone, the lean soil recipe, how high to plant it, and the honest year 1 to year 3 of what to actually expect. Just point your phone at the code here on the screen, and it is yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for. A neighbor handing a neighbor a card across the fence. And then stay right here with me, because this next one is the mistake I see good, experienced gardeners make more than any other. It is the whole difference between a lavender that lives 3 years and one that is still blooming at 15. Trick 8. Pruning is where most lavender gets either loved to death or scared to death. People either never touch it at all or they hack into it in a panic. And both roads cost you the plant. Done right, a cut is not damage. It is a signal. It tells the lavender to push out fresh, vigorous new growth, and a well-pruned plant grows faster, stays fuller, and outlives a neglected one by years. The rhythm is 2 cuts a year. The first one comes right after the main flush of flowers fades. You shear off the spent flower stalks and shape it gently. That stops the plant from pouring its energy into making seed, and it sends that energy straight back into growing instead. The second cut, and the more important of the two, comes in spring, as you see fresh new growth waking up at the base. That is when you shape the whole plant and trigger a strong flush of new stems for the season ahead. But here is the one rule you truly cannot break. It is the rule that separates a lavender that lives 15 years from one that splits open and dies in 3. Never cut back into the old, bare, woody wood at the base of the plant. Here is why, and it is simple biology. The tiny growth cells that push out fresh new shoots only live in the green, leafy part of the stem. Once a stem turns brown and woody, those cells are gone for good. The nurseries at North Carolina State and the horticulturists at Oregon State University say the very same thing, plainly. Cut down into that bare gray wood, and it will not grow back. You are left with a dead stump and a gap that never fills in again. So always keep your cut up in the green and leave a small cushion of leaves below where you snip. Cut confidently. Cut every single year. Just stay in the green. Do that, and you get a tight silver dome that bounces back fast, season after season, instead of a hollow, woody mess. Trick 9 is all about timing, and it is the one that quietly kills lavender across the colder half of this country every single year. There are 2 habits worth letting go of here. The first one, do not rush to prune in spring. In zones 5 and 6, lavender is only marginally hardy. The horticulturists at Purdue and the folks at Colorado State both make this same point, and after a hard winter, a plant can look completely and utterly dead, bare, brown, lifeless. Every instinct you have is screaming at you to cut it back hard, or just pull it out and start over. Wait. Give it until the weather has truly warmed, and you can see green shoots waking up at the base. What looks like a corpse in February is very, very often alive again by late April. Prune too early, off a guess, and you cut away the living wood it was just about to grow from. The second habit. Skip the fall haircut. It is so tempting to tidy everything up before winter. Give the lavender a neat little trim, put the whole garden to bed, but a hard cut late in the season does 2 harmful things at once. It strips off the very foliage that insulates and protects the crown through the cold, and it coaxes out tender new growth that has no time at all to harden before the frost. Growth the first hard freeze will simply kill. So make your real shaping cut back in summer, after flowering, finished a good 6 weeks before your first frost. And then leave the plant be. Let it head into winter a little shaggy and unkempt. That shagginess is a blanket. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a plant in November is nothing at all. Trick 10. The last one, and it is the fine detail that separates people who grow good lavender from the people who grow the kind that stops a stranger right there on the sidewalk. Lavender does not just want sun. It wants warmth that lingers. Long, warm days that stretch on into warm evenings. The longer that warmth holds, the longer it grows, and the harder it blooms. So do not just drop it into any old sunny spot. Plant it where it can borrow some stored heat. Think about thermal mass, which is really just anything that soaks up the sun all day and then slowly gives that warmth back after dark. A south-facing wall of stone or brick is perfect for it. So is a paved path, a big pale rock, the warm little pocket at the foot of a sunny fence. These surfaces bake all through the daytime, and then they radiate that gentle warmth back into your lavender through the cool of the evening, stretching out its growing hours and keeping its roots that little bit warmer overnight. Pair that up with the pale gravel from Trick 5, and now you have warmth coming at the plant from two directions at once, bouncing up from below and radiating out from the side. That is the exact same trick a hot, stony, south-facing hillside plays on wild lavender, and it is precisely what makes it grow like it is possessed. And here is one small twist I would add, the one that is not written in any manual. Plant it somewhere you actually walk past every single day. By the front step, along the path to the mailbox, beside the door you come home through. And there are two reasons for that. The practical one first. The plant you pass every day is the plant whose little troubles you catch early. The wet spot, the woody patch, the crowded corner, long before they become a crisis. And then the other reason, the one that matters more than it probably should, every time you brush past it, it hands you that scent, free of charge, on your way in and out of your own life. A plant like that stops being one more chore out in the yard. It becomes something that greets you. So let us go back to that crack in the wall, that strip of lavender nobody planted, nobody waters, nobody feeds, blooming its whole heart out every June beside that old stone step. You know now, exactly, what it has that the pampered plant 3 streets over does not. Sharp, lean, fast-draining ground, a dry crown held up high. Nobody's fertilizer, room to breathe, the heat coming off the stone, and a partnership underground that not one person paid a single cent for. Every one of these 10 tricks points straight back to the same quiet idea. Stop fighting what lavender is and start working with it. And I will tell you the truth. It took me far too long to learn that one. For years I killed lavender the same way most of us do, by loving it too hard. Richer soil, more water, a little feed whenever it looked peaky. I was so busy being kind to the plant that I never once stopped to feed the ground it was standing in. And the ground was the only thing that lavender ever really asked me for. The day I finally sat on my hands and let it go a little hungry, a little dry, a little wild, was the day it forgave me and bloomed. There is a patch of it by my own front step now. It gets nothing from me but one hard cut a year and an awful lot of leaving alone. And every evening when I come home, it catches my sleeve and hands me a fistful of summer. If that is the kind of gardening you come from, the honest, unhurried, feed-the-soil kind that your people knew long before the bags and the bottles ever came along, then you already belong here. Stay a while, and let us keep tending the old way, together. I will see you in the next one.